they're using more tools and data to make those decisions. It's that combination of, I'm going to create differentiation in my product, but to determine what kind of differentiation it is, I need to be more advanced analytically.
This is the eCommerce in Southeast Asia podcast with Matthew Shoney, session number 1. Let's get started.
Welcome to the eCommerce in SE Asia podcast, where it's all about understanding and winning e-commerce in Southeast Asia. And now your host, Matthew Shoney.
Thanks for joining us today. I'm super excited to welcome this week's guest, Kin Lever, to the show. Kin is a well-respected member of the product technology world in Southeast Asia e-commerce scene. He started his career in consulting with 7 years at BCG, and then moved to the commercial world as a CEO of Ukraine, Groupon, and ran a $50 million issuing product business for Visa. After that, he was the SVP of Product at Lazada, where I met Ken for the first time, the director of product at Wayfair in the US, and the head of product at Pomelo Fashion. He's also a serial entrepreneur and spends his time on his new startup, Theropoda.com, an online therapy marketplace. And he does a lot of consulting for different, mostly e-commerce focused business in Southeast Asia on product management and operations technology. For example, in the last 5 years, he's helped with Ozon, Yandex, Branded, Shipper, Wasoko, Ezie.app, Delami, Rainforest. He's always consulting at the CEO, CPO, CTO level, typically driving projects himself. Kin's most famous from the people that have worked with him for his incredible organizational systems and the disciplines that he puts into his work, which he calls Navy SEAL tactics. And he's been a big help mentor for me in my career. So I'm very excited to spend some time talking with him today about e-commerce and technology in Southeast Asia. Kin, thanks for joining. How are you doing?
Thanks, Matt. Doing good. Thanks for the intro.
Maybe we just jump into some of the questions. I mean, can you let the audience kind of know what your background is and what took you to Southeast Asia initially, and why are you still here?
I'm an atypical American in that I was doing this whole nomadic thing before it was cool. So I've lived 21 years of my life abroad, and had first seen Southeast Asia in around 2001 or so, around the time of the September 11th. I kind of knew that I loved the culture, the people. I loved that it was had a lot of energy. And then I kind of went back to Europe, spent a whole bunch of time in Russia, Ukraine, but always knew that I'd want to find myself back here. And Lazada ended up taking me back here in 2014, lived in Vietnam, loved it, 3.5 years. My child was born there. Then I kind of took another exodus for a while, but had always knew that I'd want to come back here because we just really love the region. The other thing that has always impacted me, I think it was around 1994, I was sitting in a macroeconomics class at Cornell, and they were just showing how GDP per capita in Asia was so low and it was increasing quickly. And in the US, it was already high. And it was, eventually these things would more or less converge as education and technology were available to both. And so I just kind of knew it's okay, the place to be given these dynamics was, in a developing country like in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, no, it's very similar actually to my journey. That second part, I started my career in China, and the reason that I went to China was because I was an economics major and I was watching the GDP growth rate, and this was kind of in the the heyday of China, I think, in the the early 2000s. Just approaching 2010, when China was growing 10% per year. And I think China hasn't moved on. It's definitely a more difficult environment, and you're not seeing the same growth rates. But I see more and more focus to Southeast Asia for that same reason, and that's what brought me here for kind of the same reason. And I think it's pretty cool and pretty common. But what year did you first arrive into the region and start doing business here?
I would say that was probably around 2001. I think my first strategy consulting project, and I was based in Tokyo, was for Nestle Malaysia in 2001. And it was a little bit before September 11th, because I remember arriving and being in Bangsar in Malaysia, KL, and kind of watching the towers go down. So that was my first real experience, and it was doing consulting for Nestle.
Got it. So since 2001, so we're at 21 years now looking at what's happened in the region. So coming from a US and a consulting venture background, what are some of the biggest like eye-opening differences that you see about, the landscape and the operating environment in Southeast Asia versus US or Europe, where I think most of our listeners are coming from?
I'm an e-commerce guy, so I can probably talk most to that. I think there's a lot of other, wider differences that can be talked to. In terms of what, the areas that I focus on in e-com, I'd say that, I was in the US in 17 and 18 working Wayfair. I've dabbled with my own Shopify and Amazon stores in the US, and it's just really competitive and really, a lot more mature. Like you're dealing with some powerful private label brands. There's a culture of this entrepreneurship among young Americans. A lot of them might be doing a normal job, but they're running an Amazon or a Shopify business on the side, and that's been the culture for like a decade or more in the US. It's been cool, and there's communities and there's YouTube videos, and that I think in Southeast Asia is just kind of starting. That's one of the big things I see in my realm.
Yeah, that ecosystem for education is definitely very different. I've had a hard time pinpointing, the root cause of that. You could say that it's because Southeast Asia it's still early on the journey, but I think it's also partially just because of the marketplace differences and the economics earning potential differences, right? So and I'll clarify that just by kind of talking about happened with the Amazon movement in the US is, the FBA program opened. People found that they could, use this Amazon infrastructure, easily plug themselves into the largest online demand source in the world and, white label products and do growth hacking and make quite a bit of money. That created the courses, right? So that the independent educators that are, making money selling courses to aspiring entrepreneurs, and of course the SaaS businesses as well. You just don't really see that in Southeast Asia yet. Lazada and Shopee, they have their authorized trainer partners. These trainer partners are advanced sellers that will give kind of sponsored education pieces. But my perspective is that's not really landing home so well because it feels like it's coming from the marketplace too much rather than from the the entrepreneur perspective themselves. And it's almost like there's some sort of agenda maybe, or at least a feeling that it's coming from this business rather than from an individual that's trying to help me. And it's, I think it's just, it hasn't really taken off for that reason. Another thing is just with the 6 different markets, in each market being varying sizes, but definitely smaller than what you have in the US and Europe, I think that you need 6 different communities, right? 6 very different communities, and each of those communities is drawing from a macro level, a smaller pool of, potential folks. But I'd be really excited to see that evolve a little bit more because it's probably my favorite thing about e-commerce in the US is that community, the private label folks helping one another to grow their business. I think it's a really, really special, cool thing that I hope we can get into Southeast Asia.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think it's definitely a lot tougher with all the different cultures and languages. And I think that there's an influence in Southeast Asia from China being so close and Lazada, Shopee kind of having strong links to China. I think ever since 16 or so when we were in Lazada, they had a cross-border business. You had Chinese sellers selling into the region. So I think it's a more difficult kind of climate than what you were dealing with 15 or 16 in the US. The other thing I'd mentioned, I was in Russia in 18. E-com marketplaces really only took off in Russia in 2018. And it was kind of that feeling of the gold rush which probably happened in the US like in 15 or 16 when anybody they could just sell on Amazon and they sold and it was profitable. And that's when I think a lot of these private label sellers really started like paying a ton of attention to that space. And in Russia, I started seeing that in 18. And I think here, because you're relegated to a single market and you already have Chinese sellers competing, like it's not that gold rush feeling. So I think it's more difficult.
You can't just throw up a widget or a hyper niche product and make, 50,000 a month in revenue in a lot of the markets, right? You got to go a little bit deeper, a little bit more aggressive, bigger niches, and really differentiate yourself because you start to compete against, big legacy existing brands as an entrepreneur. So it's definitely more challenging in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of success stories, and we'll be bringing them into this podcast so you can kind of hear some of the stories. But definitely very, very different. I'd say more complex environment to operate in for sure. Yeah. Next question, Ken, you coming from a strong supply chain logistics background, what have you seen in the past couple of years in Southeast Asia e-commerce that's interesting and notable from your perspective? Or what are you excited about from the ops side of the e-commerce world that most of our listeners are probably not aware of?
A lot of Southeast Asian sellers, they were sourcing product locally, and a lot of it was coming from China. And this allowed their supply chain to be relatively not complex because they could just buy product when they needed to from a local distributor. And I think the margins and, I guess competition direct from the Chinese is making that harder. More and more are buying from China, more and more realizing, okay, if I just buy your standard stuff from Alibaba or something, like I'm going to be competing against a Chinese seller who's probably even making the product, right? So it's kind of like difficult no-win game. I think you start to see like, okay, they're starting to think, how do I find a differentiated product or create product differentiation in my supply chain? That's where I think like the next wave of evolution is.
So when you talk about differentiation in your supply chain, can you give some examples of what that would mean to our audience?
You like the large Amazon sellers, and I've helped a couple aggregators, and I think they operate in a similar way, is they do research on what product they want to have and like how are they going to differentiate against the competition. And it might mean some adaptations in the product. And therefore, they're working with like a Chinese supplier to create a product that is unique to them, right? And it may not be massively different. It is something that their competitors will not directly have the exact same product. And so I think that concept, okay, like I'm not just going to buy something, but I'm going to ask the supplier to create something for me. That I think is kind of something that's starting to become more popular here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I couldn't agree more. I think the competition just drives that. The ecosystem that's set up for cross-border sellers to from China to sell into Southeast Asia is already there. And factories are already selling on Taobao. So that same factory that you're buying for most likely has a Taobao store already. And there's a quick, easy way for Taobao sellers to click a couple buttons and cross-list their products into Southeast Asia. So if you don't differentiate, or create a strong brand story or come with something unique to the table, you're going to have a hard time competing, and you could potentially find yourself competing directly against your factory, which is definitely not a sustainable position to be in for a new brand, unless you absolutely nail branding, which you could, but I think it'll be very difficult.
What I'd add to that is you need that product differentiation, right? And if you do it kind of randomly, like I think that this product, and if I change it in this way, it'll work. If you do that, like you've got a very high chance of it not working, and you're sitting on a whole bunch of useless inventory, and you've gone through a massive effort to get the product out to begin with. So which is why these more advanced white label sellers, I think in the US that Matt, you're familiar with, they're using more tools and data to make those decisions. So I think like it's that combination of I'm going to create differentiation in my product, but to determine what kind of differentiation it is, I need to be more advanced analytically. And I think that is the other thing that is coming here.
Just to continue on that, to talk about some of that, I think it would be interesting for our audience to hear some of the the analytical approaches and tools and strategies that brands and sellers come up with when they're launching new products. The first and the leading mechanism is to basically identify what's selling already, and trying to come up with, a way to identify the products that have a reasonable amount of monthly sales volume at the moment, because that basically determines whether or not it's even worth entering. And then from there, you want to come up with a way to basically beat the incumbent that's taking, a lion's share of that niche revenue. It's both an art and a science to an extent, right? You can apply some scientific principles to it, but you still do fall back into kind of the design from, the design perspective, designing something new from scratch. You can use tools like you can look at the reviews of the incumbent's product listings and see where the product is coming up short, and then design a product that covers those shortcomings and make that very clear in your product listing. I've seen sellers also do testing, like so taking a product to market, getting feedback even before it's produced to determine whether or not they think they have product market fit before they start the manufacturing. And there's a lot of polling softwares in the US that actually streamline this process for sellers. And I'm not aware of any of those in Southeast Asia, but that would be a pretty interesting thing to see if any sellers out there in Southeast Asia are using this data-driven approach to validate whether they have product market fit before they absorb these massive MOQs of 1,000, 10,000, 20,000 units.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. Like, I feel like when I was helping Branded, I saw the inside world of how the large FBA Amazon sellers operate. And I'd always kind of seen it as, okay, like your ability to make it is in a large part chance, and kind of like the algorithm's a little bit difficult to understand. But then I saw like, wow, you can actually de-risk and kind of take a very systematic approach, and you've got a very high chance of making your product successful just by kind of knowing who you're competing against and knowing where they are a bit weak and you can beat them, and knowing a bit about how the algorithm works. And so I think this systematic approach where, okay, I know the demand is there, and I'm going to take a very systematic approach to beating the incumbent competition. Like, I don't think that approach is being used in Southeast Asia much.
I agree. I think it's a great opportunity. It would be interesting to see what comes out of some of these aggregators that have popped up in the region in Southeast Asia, to kind of see what their take on new product development is, and if they're incorporating some of the best practices that we see in the US. So that's folks like Armada Brands, Hypefast, Grow Commerce, Open Labs. A number of aggregators have popped up in Southeast Asia in the past 2 years or so. I think are bringing that level of maturity. And I'm sure it's there in some pockets of sellers in the region. Definitely not as big as in the US. Next question, Ken. If you could give just one piece of advice to e-commerce startups or incumbent leaders that are just moving into Southeast Asia, what would that advice be?
So I've started a number of small businesses, and they always seem at the beginning like, oh, okay, like this is an easy win, right? And you start to test hypotheses and see why some of those early hypotheses didn't work. And you get to like a stronger understanding of what might actually work, right? And when you do all that, like you often find yourself getting closer and closer to models that already exist in other countries. And you start to understand why that model looks the way it does. And you start to realize that your hypothesis that, oh, hey, I can just like totally wreck it because I have this great idea, is often not the case. So my only advice would be like, don't just assume that like everybody else is dumb and your idea is like nobody's thought about it. And rather like make sure you've systematically done your homework on what are the similar models in other countries that have made it. And then do your reverse engineering. Like, what did they look like a couple of years ago? What were they doing on SEO and this and that? And I think that is the approach you got to take if you're going to get into something new and you're going to really invest a lot into it.
Where do you think we're going What do you think Southeast Asia e-commerce is going to look like in the next 5 years or so?
I see this trend in the US and the West where like people want to be content creators and they want to be individual entrepreneurs and they want to own their own destiny. And, the cool thing when I was growing up of working for a large company and being a corporate person is like the last thing you want to do now. I think that is totally going to resonate more and more with Southeast Asian younger folks. And it's generational because like they're maybe the parents of people that previously the parents like were very much against that, but now I think like parents are starting to accept that that's the thing to do. So you're going to see more and more of this like young independent content creators. They're not worried about the career path. They want to create their own brands. And I think that's going to change the Southeast Asian landscape a lot. You're going to see more of these like hustlers and community folks. And I really like the idea of like create content, create a community first, and then build a business around that. And I think a lot of what you're going to see in Southeast Asia is going to be exactly that approach, is that they're going to get the fit, like creating an audience, and then they're going to create the product around that.
Definitely agree with you on kind of the movement towards starting your own thing. I'm seeing it more and more in some of the Southeast Asian e-commerce communities that I'm a part of via Split Dragon. The influencer movement and content is, as a way to generate an audience and then convert that audience into revenue. I think Southeast Asia is almost ahead of the US in some cases. Maybe not with the like YouTube influencers and kind of Instagram influencers, but TikTok commerce is here. It's been here for a while and has shown like very good traction. Live streaming, has been a big aspect of Southeast Asia e-commerce for quite a while as well. And those are both, very, like I would say, like core content, production activities for an e-commerce brand that we don't really do that much in the US. Or I mean, they're nice to have, but maybe not must have. Whereas pretty much every successful, brand in Southeast Asia marketplace e-commerce has invested and dabbled in a little bit of live streaming in the past year or two.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're looking at two different competencies. You have a person that is a good content creator, and that's a different mindset in my view. And then you have people that are good at e-commerce, and that is very like a systematic operational mindset. And so it's rare that you're going to get a person that's absolutely good at both. But what you're seeing more and more is like the two different people come together. And that's what I think you're going to see some of these content creators and live streamers in Southeast Asia really take it to the next level, is they're going to hook up with a person or a business that's really going to systematize like what products they create and making sure it's quality product and getting it out on all the channels and whatnot. So I think that is where we're at and where you're really going to start to see things really scale.
Yeah, there's endless opportunity when you have a captive audience, right? To generate revenue. And I almost feel like influencers and brands are going to merge more and more in the future. And you can see that with like every new Kardashian product launch, right? And the success of Conor McGregor and his brands, and basically just more and more celebrities using their audience to get behind something from an e-commerce perspective. I have a good friend who's been doing TikTok videos and Instagram, Max Grubb, shout out Max. He is the owner of Max the Meat Guy. You can check him out on Instagram and TikTok, several million followers now. And I was able to catch up with him a couple weeks ago and try to understand, what's next. And the first thing that came out of his mouth was, I need to look into building a brand. I need to look into building products and taking products to these existing audience and opening up, a valuable business that I could potentially sell. I think this convergence of influencers and brands and e-commerce selling is just going to get, more and more interesting in the future.
Yeah, completely. And I've like my eyes have really been open the last few weeks because me and my son, we watch Mr. Beast, at least a few like programs every night, and I see where Mr. Beast came from and where, because you see his videos from some years ago and you see how many he's getting, like 150 million views each, and he's marketing the product inside his video, not relying on the YouTube ad revenue. As a person who's done a bit of the acquisition marketing himself, and you see how much you're paying to get your weak kind of exposure, conversion is just horrible. Like, you see what a massive benefit it is. Like, this exposure he's getting is free for him. But you just see that, okay, like, this is like an awesome way to acquire and retain customers.
Yeah, I think globally, since the Facebook attribution iOS changes by about a year ago, like e-commerce businesses across the world have had to rethink their acquisition strategies. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for disrupting the way acquisition is done. And a lot of it is content and influencers and partnerships and affiliate. Google and Facebook will certainly continue to have a strong role in the digital marketing, acquisition stack of e-commerce businesses. But I've just felt like in the past year, there's never been as much movement or excitement, going towards influencers and to affiliate and referral and partnerships, because the cost per acquisition is just, it's went up 20-25% for pretty much all brand owners, across the world, because of that Facebook attribution change via iOS.
Yeah, completely.
What's one thing about e-commerce supply chain and your expertise there that almost no one agrees with you about?
I would say that at least on the system and the process side. So I'd say I'm more on the system and the process side than the person running the warehouse or creating the products. So on that, I think I'm up there among a handful of people that have seen as many, like the most companies do it in various ways. I've seen how Lazada and Alibaba do it. I've seen how Wayfair does it. I've seen how some of the Russian platforms like Ozon and Yandex did it. And I've seen how some players here in Southeast Asia do it. Like, what I've generally concluded is it's not like, it's more of a formula than like, okay, like there's many ways. Like there's more or less a formula in my view to how to build it to scale and make it clean, right? In terms of like what systems to use and how the systems connect, what the process should be. And therefore, like a number of people, I think in various places have disagreed with that. Like they want to be more creative about how they do it. But in my view, like they will arrive eventually at the same conclusion that like there's only one more or less, there's some nuances, but like there's one way to do it.
Could you take that just a little bit deeper and give kind of an example of unnecessary reinvention of the wheel for Southeast Asia that ends up hurting the business rather than helping?
I usually think software first. So I would think about, if you're building a business to scale, use an order management system that connects to all your sales channels. Have that easily integrate with not just your WMS, but like connected to multiple warehouse providers, and you can use some of the warehouse aggregators. And on the logistics side as well, be able to connect to many logistics players easily. And so just create this architecture that allows you to connect to many channels, many warehouses, many logistics, and have very good centralized view on how this is all working so that you can create good scale and automation. And you should be thinking along those lines from day one. I think a lot of folks don't really do that.
Got it. Where can listeners find you online, Ken?
So I am pretty active on LinkedIn. I like to just shoot out my thoughts when I have them, and I run a newsletter sometimes. I'm also on, I keep a blog, which I've been less active on lately, but it's called endgameken.com. That's where to find me.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us today, Ken. Listeners, we'll put the way that you can keep in touch with Ken in the show notes. That's at his blog, endgameken.com. We're also following him on LinkedIn, where he's got a pretty cool newsletter. Thanks for listening today, and thanks for your time, Ken.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. It's been great.
Thanks for spending your time with us today and listening. I hope you learned something new that will help your business or your career. For new listeners, please find all the resources, links, and show notes at splitdragon.com/podcast. And if you want to continue the conversation and connect with other e-commerce leaders in Southeast Asia, join us in our Discord community. The link to the community is in our podcast page, splitdragon.com/podcast. This episode of e-commerce in Southeast Asia is sponsored by SplitDragon. SplitDragon offers technology and professional services to help brands, agencies, and sellers enter, launch, and grow their online sales channels in Southeast Asia. If you're just getting started, you can use SplitDragon tools like Shopee's sales database or Lazada sales database to understand current product sales volume. And if you're already selling, you can use tools like competitor intelligence and search rank tracking, financial management, and A/B testing to grow your business. Additionally, SplitDragon's professional services has helped large global brands like Unilever, Laneige, and HP, as well as small startups win in Southeast Asia marketplace e-commerce. From advisory and consulting to custom data analytics to running paid ads to launching new products, SplitDragon can help grow your online sales in Southeast Asia. If you want to use data to grow your e-commerce business without the guesswork, please visit our sponsor, splitdragon.com.